Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 117th edition of the Frank and Stan Chat. And it's a real privilege because we have Sir David Carter as our guest today. I've known David for, well, it must be nearly 10 years or so. So it's great to have you join us. Thank you, David.
It's my pleasure, Stan, Frank and Stan. Really good to be with you this morning.
Yeah, thank you. Stan, you've got a tan. Stan's got a tan.
I've recently got out of room 101 after the last episode. I was sent into room 101.
Banished. Anyway, you've just come back from a week in Greece, I believe.
Yeah, I went visiting my sister who lives in Kos. So yeah, so I've not seen any news. I've not seen any information. So I'm new to it all this week.
Well, it's a shock when you open the newspaper.
It's a one news story.
Yeah, I don't think much has happened, has it, since I went away?
Well, there are lots of queues around London. So, if people looking back on this recording, it's the week after the Queen has died, and the country appears to have gone into a deep sense of mourning. So there are very long queues around London, walking past the coffin. So anyway. It's great to have you, David. I don't know if you want to just explain to some colleagues who perhaps are not aware of what you've done and who you are. If you could just give us a brief summary of that sort of career.
Yeah, I'll have a go. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. So I started teaching in 1983. I did a music degree, so I'm a musician by background. I taught music and PE for most of my career, including when I was a head. I became a head in Gloucestershire. I went into Bristol for my second headship and was head of John Cabot City Technology College. And off the back of that and some of the work that we were doing with other schools in East Bristol, we set up the Cabot Learning Federation, which is one of the very first MATs in the Southwest. 2014, I became Southwest Regional Schools Commissioner, which was really exciting. It was a new job. Did it for a year and then was appointed to lead that team as National Schools Commissioner when I left the DFE in 2018. And since then, the bits of work I now do are very much with trusts, with schools, developing leadership, helping with CEO recruitment. I'm a trustee at Centrepoint, which I really enjoy doing. That is fantastic work. And sort of get a nice balance these days between work and play.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, it's interesting. We're going to sort of cover a number of issues today. But the point you raised there about your background being in music and PE, I have a bit of a concern about leadership roles, because if there's a sort of a shortage in maths or science subjects, I'm finding that some of those colleagues are being promoted to quite senior roles, onto senior leadership teams. And I can see a sort of future where colleagues who've come through the music PE route simply are not in that, have less of a chance because they've not been given the opportunity early. I don't know, is that something that you've noticed, or is it just my observation?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, back in the day, and I'm talking probably 20 years ago, I remember the National College did a survey of the subject background of secondary heads, and I was one of 2% of secondary heads who had a music degree. And I'd be surprised if it was 2% now.
Yeah.
And yet, I think about my subject and I think about my experience as a PE teacher, and quite often what you do in those two subjects is you are corralling large numbers of children, whether it's for a concert or it's for a sports day or in a big massive PE lesson, whatever you might be doing, talking to kids in assemblies. These are things that if you're a classroom teacher of another subject, you often don't get exposed to. So I think those two subjects often give you a really good exposure to leadership. But what I'm worried about the arts in general in schools at the moment, and where so many schools, not through a philosophical decision, but purely financial decision making, are reducing the arts down to either a modular subject or a carousel in Key Stage 3. And of course, if you have that, you won't get GCSE groups coming through. And if you don't have that, you don't have A-level groups. And I think it's one of those things that once a subject starts to die, it's very hard to get it back. So I think you're going to see music departments of 1.5 people if you've got that, and I think that's a real shame, because I think one of the things I really love about the diversity of school leadership is people bring different experiences to that role. And I think that's really, really important. And from my perspective, teaching in London, in Reading, in quite interesting schools, often children who weren't successful academically were in the arts and PE. And if they don't have that outlet, so they feel that they're good at something in school, then actually all they get is lesson after lesson where they're told they're failing. And that will only make this problem worse.
I have a personal interest in this. My son's got a degree in music.
Oh, great.
He's PGCE. At the time when you got a bursary to be a music teacher, £9,000. And as he qualified, Michael Gove managed to decimate music by not including any arts in the baccalaureate. So there was literally no jobs to get. Having been a shortage subject 2 years earlier, there were no jobs, and he ended up doing peripatetic, and now he's a TA in a school.
See, I think that's really interesting, Stan, because I think what I'm seeing around the country is heads are saying, right, the bit that we don't want to lose is the showpiece, production or the carol concert, because we bring parents to that, and that's a really good thing for our school. But come and have a look at what we do on a wet Friday afternoon in December, and you won't find it. And so I worry that music, and I don't think PE will probably get, because there's more of a political imperative about healthy schools, isn't there? But I don't think there's the same imperative for the arts, and the arts will, I think, simply be relegated to the showpiece extracurricular. And the whole point for me as a musician is, if you don't give the kids the skills to play an instrument, they have nothing to offer to a school production. So actually, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And I absolutely get and experience tells you that there are some children who the academic world isn't for, who are actually stunningly good artists or suddenly good musicians. And I can remember a time when that was enough in a primary school, that you were a brilliant artist, to give you credibility amongst your peers, even though you were SEM when it came to maths and English, but what a brilliant artist. And if that disappears, then we're going to have a reasonable percentage, I would say, of young people who've got nothing because they're failing in two areas.
Yeah, and I've taught kids who've gone on to be professional musicians who have made not just a good living, but a really good living out of it.
Yeah.
In terms of the potential earning income, both for them personally, but also for the country, in terms of the kind of impact of the arts on the economy. And one of the schools I taught at in the mid-late 1990s, one of the pupils there was Jamie Redknapp, who, if you're not a football fan, Jamie went on to play for Liverpool and England. But what used to happen there was his mum used to drop Jamie at the front entrance. He'd come and sign into tutor group, and then Dad would pick him up to go training at the back entrance. and I know I'm not for one second advocating that was a good thing, and we shouldn't go back to those days. But actually, Jamie Redknapp probably in year 10 and year 11 was going to get more from being on the training pitch and developing his football talent, because he got a move to Liverpool when he was 17, than he would have been coming to any of the other lessons. I'm not holding that up as a model, but those were the times in which we kind of said that let's find the talent of every individual kid and let's help them.
Yeah, I can remember having an argument with another teacher about a young lad who ought to have been a professional footballer. He didn't have the family support to be able to do that, but they complained that he only came in when there was football matches on. And I said, and he's saying that's a bad thing. What we're saying is he comes into school for the day in order to play football. At the end of the day, then he's in school. If it wasn't for the football, he wouldn't be in school. Well, he shouldn't play.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic solution.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things you were going to talk about, David, sort of breaking with tradition here, Stan, because this leads in neatly to a recruitment and retention issue, doesn't it? Because I was struck by the government have announced that a physics program that they devised a couple of years ago has actually produced just 23 physics teachers in the last 2 years. And this is in science is traditionally a difficult subject to attract teachers to. But actually, although some of the primary figures seem to be holding up, there are a swathe of secondary subjects which are simply not being filled, and so we're sitting on potentially, I think the TS ran 6,000 vacancies, and this is a massive recruitment and retention issue. I'm just interested in, what your views are in terms of how that's been created and what some of the solutions might be.
So I'm pleased that you talked about recruitment and retention in the same sentence there, because I think they are inextricably linked. So there is a recruitment challenge because there's a retention challenge, and I've always felt that we have more to influence the retention challenge and possibly the recruitment one, because if you've got a young teacher who comes into a school that I'm leading and after 2 or 3 years they decide it's not for them, I have to look at myself and work out what did we not provide then that stimulated you enough to want to stay. And I get that people try it and it's not for them, but not on the numbers we're talking about. So there's something about how do we as leaders and educators make those first 3, 4, 5 years so fulfilling that you provide that bedrock for a career going forward in that way around. I suppose my experience from being in the DFE, and it still seems to be carrying on, is that there are some really strange strategies and ideas to solve this problem. You know, they are still wedded to the idea that in terms of particularly recruitment in some of the hard to reach areas and some of the seaside towns in the north, which you'll be very familiar with, obviously, yeah, from great work that you've done. But the simple answer is get your graduates from Oxbridge, pay their mortgage for them and send them up north to do missionary work. And I really worry about that, because the amount of money that they try to invest in that program, have they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to target the people who are already committed to working in those areas and almost make it either a master's profession for them or pay them more money, which is the other thing that they do. That would have been a better long-term solution to it. And I don't think government can ever solve this problem, because they're too far away from it. It's too remote. And they try to find a one-size-fits-all solution because the Treasury says you can't have all these different funding streams. So there is something about how do we think about that and almost reconceptualize the role of a teacher. Workload is absolutely a problem. You know, the workforce census in 2019, I think it was, talked about 57-hour working weeks. And when you think about teachers in terms of their actual contact time, it's probably maximum 23 hours. You know, there's a really big question mark for me there about, so what are we doing with the other 30 plus hours, and how do we change that? You know, should we as leaders be saying, right, in the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to take that 57 down to 50 and then 50 to 45 and do something along those lines. And I don't think it would be that difficult to do that, to do some of that reduction around that. So there's that element of that. But there's also the notion of what being a continuous learner is as an adult, I think. And so CPD is probably as good now across the sector as I've ever seen it. But I still think it needs to be more bespoke. And I think it still needs to be more rooted in coaching and mentoring and people being developed as individuals around, and they're developed as individuals, not just as practitioners, but as people as well. Because we sense, we get this, you know, I always had at the back of my mind's ahead that the person I was talking to, who was a maths teacher or a physics teacher or whatever, is also a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, uncle, aunt. And in life, excuse my French, shit happens. And sometimes you've got to understand that as a leader before you can talk to them about becoming a better deliverer of assessment for learning, to use a phrase from the back in the day. So I think there is something about how we think about that relationship between the workforce and leadership and strategy, and how you build a culture. So school cultures, I promise you, if we look at 21,000 school websites right now, not that we'd ever have the will to do it, but if we did, they'd all say something really powerful and motivating about mission and vision, because that's what they're meant to do. The reality on the ground is sometimes very different. And a lot of the leadership development that I've been doing with people, which is around thinking about the kind of culture you put people into so they'll stay in the profession, is about that relationship where culture is, for me, a product of values and behavior. So if we say children first, or we say that we talk to children in a respectful way, or whatever that might be, that's what we have to do. That we have to walk that talk. And so the axis that happens in schools between children and children, adults and adults, and adults and children, is where that culture lives and breathes. If you get that right, I think people begin to feel a sense of belonging to that institution and that loyalty. And even if they're in a large trust, where the trust is, you know, has another lens which you look at your career through, your emotional contact day to day is in a school. That's where you go. That's where you drive your car or get your bus to. That's where you go to work. And I think if we get that cultural bit right, that will start to help it. And we move away from the idea of let's try the latest fad. Let's try the latest, throw a bit of money at this problem. Because the reality is going to be for the next probably 5 to 10 years is that the pockets of money that are available to do this at a national scale aren't going to be there. So it's for us as leaders to actually make them, shape the weather and make it a great place to work.
Yeah, it's that, make it an enjoyable place. Find out why people get in the car to go there in the morning, and make that something that everybody shares and enjoys.
Couldn't agree more.
It's really not that difficult, but it's about having a mindset that said, I'm actually going to be interested in the people I'm working with. And maybe, maybe we say, because we're supposed to say that we're all about the children, but maybe we ought to be thinking sometimes we're also about the people that we work with.
I saw a tweet, Stan, about this about 3 weeks ago. So it was the tail end of the summer holidays, and a young teacher, I don't follow them, but somebody retweeted it, and put up a thing. They said, look, my grandmother died in the holidays. I'm an early career teacher. I'm about to start my second year. Should I go and ask my head for a day off?
I saw
or what should I say to them? And I remember thinking, blimey, there's a perfect example for you to find out about the kind of school you work in then.
Yeah.
Because if you, as a young teacher who has a relationship with a grandparent who's just died, and your head says, no, it's not a close enough relative, that's not a place you want to be.
No, absolutely. No. And the thing is, as a leader, that gets paid back 10, 20
absolutely,
times.
100%.
No, I just remember, I always use this one as the example of the other end of it. This was before paternity leave, and a member of staff's wife had a child, and he said, can I take some time? And I said, just take as much as you need. I'll cover for your class. Take as much as you need. Thinking 2 or 3 days. 2 weeks later, I had to ring him to say, when are you coming back?
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. I think there are times also, though, when I think, particularly for head teachers, they're sort of like, they have that sort of belief that they are for the children, but they sort of get wrapped up in some of the ideology that's being promoted, as if to say, well, that won't be viewed positively by whoever it may be. And of course, there is this sort of like, whether it's the trust board or whether it's your governing body or whatever, you've got that dynamic as well when you're a head teacher. So at times you feel as though, you want to be brave, you want to do what is in effect the right thing, but there are forces leaning against you that sort of curtail your sort of the flex that you feel you've got. And I think particularly for those heads serving some of the most challenging communities, when you think, actually, this is a bit of a revolution, and I'm worried. Actually, we've made so many strides here. I don't think it's going to take as much further. It's dried up, that source. But actually, to move, way beyond that, or to move further away down a different route, it's a challenge for some heads to do that.
It is, and the bit that I think contributes to that is that we're now in an era, and we have been in it for quite a while, where heads are constantly aware that they're being watched for almost every decision that they take, and potentially judged for it. So whether it's whether it's the regulatory process of it's a DFE or it's Ofsted or it's a local authority, just saying, possibly questioning a decision that you've made, and then your governing body or your trust board, or the wider sector. There are so many positives about social media, but actually some of the school shaming that goes on is just outrageous from other people who should know better. So there is also a sense that probably I started being a head in 1997. There was a very definite sense of the buck stops for me, and it felt a little bit lonely at times. But I was allowed to make my mistakes in private. And I'm not sure that a new head today in a large multi-academy trust, or not necessarily in one of those, in the maintained sector or the diocese, has quite the same level of protection, if you like, from the fact that no one is looking in quite the same way. So your decisions are scrutinised, and they're scrutinised from a right or wrong perspective rather than a values perspective, and that worries me about how we retain heads and recruit heads.
Yeah, good.
I do think because I'm a strong believer in authenticity in leadership, that actually if you are true to your own values, then those aren't as difficult to deal with, those wounds, as they are if you're playing a part because you think that's what other people want you to do.
Yeah, I agree.
Then when you're criticised for something that you're doing when you think you're doing it for them anyway, that's really much harder to take.
Yeah, I agree.
Really good book called A Wounded Leader. It was written by an American. I don't know who Can't remember the author's name, and I only had one copy of it, and I lent it out and never got it back. But that was all about that because you're emotionally engaged in schools, when someone criticizes you, it's a personal. If you're stacking shelves in Tesco and somebody says you're not stacking those right, it's a shrug of the shoulders and redo it. But doing something that you are emotionally committed to and someone telling you that's not right, that's a real wound to you.
Yeah. I remember in 1992, it was the year I got appointed to a primary, 88 it was, the year I got appointed to a primary school in a really challenging community. There were literally only 3 candidates for this job. You know, it was a very small school. It was on a housing estate, council estate in Manchester. And I remember sending out the school holiday lists, you know, on a letter, as you did then. And it must have been about 2 terms later, we had an odd sort of inset day. I didn't set that inset day, but it was on a Friday. I don't know why it was there, but I couldn't change it. And a number of the secretary who lived near to the school phoned me at home to say loads of kids had turned up thinking school's on today. And my immediate thought was, oh, you know, what did we put in that letter? You know, I have to say, I had no fear that I was going to lose my job over that cock up. As it turned out, we did tell them, but you know, they went in a bag, nobody looked at it. It was a Friday. Everybody goes to school on a Friday. I didn't have a fear that I was going to be castigated on social media. I didn't fear that if I'd made the mistake, that the governing body were going to sort of lean on me very hard, you know, because actually the governing body was pretty ineffective. You know, it was my show and we were heading where I wanted to go, which in itself isn't a good thing. But I didn't fear a cock up like that. Now, nowadays, I just can't imagine what would happen if our grandchildren went to a school and suddenly, you know, they've failed to let the parents know. There would be all the issues then around, you know, caring for those kids during the day with the parents. That's, you know, that was not an issue on that estate. I can tell you that now. The kids just walked home and, you know, somebody was there to meet them. And if they weren't, the neighbours looked after them. You know, but actually that sort of fear of that now, we've got to a position where, you know, anything like that, you know, on a Thursday, some day in May, you know, some relatively, you know, a cock up of sorts could see you off.
Well, you get a whistle blowing to Ofsted and the Daily Mail would print it.
Yeah,
that's what happened.
Yeah. The worst thing I got like that, Frank, was nothing to do with me, but I was still hauled over it. It was that the caretaker overslept on a voting day, and we were a voting venue, and it opened half an hour late. And the chair of governors, who was a very staunch conservative, went absolutely mad that people hadn't been able to vote and people who were working, blah, blah. It was a genuine error. She'd overslept. She came as soon as she could and she opened the school up. Nothing to do with me. I wasn't there on that day, but I got hauled over the coals for it.
Stan, do you want what's caught your eye this week?
Well,
we'll quickly run through this because actually that conversation was a lot more interesting than stuff that you and I come up with every week.
I was going to say, you're just going to say it's a lot more interesting than anything you can mention. No, what caught my eye was only something I read yesterday, which was about the Oak National Academy and the way that's appearing to move into a government body, by want of a different phrase. I love this phrase that it's strategically aligned but operationally independent from the DfE. I think that sounds like Ofsted in a way. But it does worry me that it's kind of a stepping stone for somebody to then say, no, this is how it should be.
And it just needs Ofsted to lean on that, doesn't it?
But what was interesting with what I caught yesterday was it was educational publishers who were objecting to it because of the impact on their business, I suspect. And the fact that, you know, the letter that they jointly wrote said, you know, we produce the best educational resources in the world, blah, blah, blah. We make lots of money for the country by doing that. But it wasn't aimed. I was hoping that the objection was aimed at the principle that maybe this shouldn't be a government body, because it really ought to be, I don't know, in my view, some sort of charitable overseen by people who have a diverse view of education.
Yeah.
I suspect that might not be.
I don't think that's happening at the moment, is it? I mean, I think also what good on was it John Coles who stood up and said this isn't right? Good. Somebody willing to put their head above the parapet. It's a shame that many others aren't willing to do the same. If they agree with John's approach, and everybody I speak to can see the problem, but actually don't want to be identified. And in a way, the way this is all woven round, I think this is an issue around some multi-academy trusts that are concerned about not upsetting the boat, too much.
If you
anyway,
want to reduce teacher workload, and this might be a way of doing it, then fund it, but fund it for an independent group to manage it. I don't see why it's all about control. I've got to pull it back so that we can say what's in.
I agree with that, Stan. I think my slight worry about this is the way that I think Ofsted will be sitting in Ofsted Towers, chuckling quietly in the corner about this one, because Ofsted's inspection regime has been blown apart by the fact they've got no data they can rely upon, so they have to look at something else, and curriculum will be it. And whether Ofsted likes what Oak has done or not, and I think it's probably a mixed view, the reality is now that they're almost been given leeway to say, okay, we think curriculum should look like this. And there are examples of schools where outcomes are really strong, but they've been given an RI because the curriculum isn't meeting the desired or necessary inputs and the design structures. And I think that's a very dangerous road to go down, because at that point you cease to be a regulator and you become a think tank. And that for Ofsted is very dangerous, I think.
I think it's also very dangerous that you've got so much power in the hands of one or two inspectors, in terms of determining whether or not, because whatever happens, there's no way that Amanda Spielman and her senior colleagues are actually visiting the school to see what the impact of that curriculum is. They're just looking at evidence bases. And I've done that for many years, and they don't tell you very much, because actually it's in effect note-taking by the inspector, often to justify the judgment that they want to give. So at the end of the day, you and I could look at that and take a completely different viewpoint on it. And in a way, that the power has shifted from, in a sense, data into preferred practice. And actually that's very, I obviously it's going to lead to inconsistency.
And Frank, you and I have both been
greater inconsistency.
Both work with people who've made their judgment and now going to find the evidence to support that judgment. As opposed to have a look at what's actually going on and report it.
Well, it's like I keep going back to, because I'm doing work in Liverpool with Jonathan Jones, who's an ex-HMI, and we were looking at early years provision and the loss of children's centres and things like that. And the government's eventually got around to thinking, well, we ought to perhaps do stuff around family hubs, which in effect is trying to recreate something that they said wasn't very good in the first place. But the hypothesis, when I was involved in the research into those children's centres, the hypothesis that one of the hypotheses was that the children's centres have been taken over by the middle classes, and that in effect those centres were not serving the needs of that community. And the issue there was, you set that up as a hypothesis. The questions you then create for inspectors to ask are about driving that hypothesis. So little surprise that the report came out finding that was the case. In some areas. So in a way, all of this is when you're involved in that level, you realise how you're being stitched up quietly behind the scenes. And no matter how hard you work, for those children's centres, some of them are going to fail.
Yeah, but
even though they probably weren't.
When I was working in Lancashire, that there was a thought process that you either had to support the disadvantaged or risk the middle class, or basically they couldn't see you could do both.
Yeah, well, and that is a good thing.
You could have something that provided free. I mean, baby massage was one that you were doing, and they did, but baby massage was free. And I said, well, what about people who could afford to pay for that, which would actually pay for the free stuff if you think it through properly? And it was like, whoa, no, we don't go do anything like that. That's it's not something we do. And having spent the last 10 years in a local authority on marketed services and making not a profit. You're not allowed to make a profit. You can make a surplus, but you can't make a profit.
That's the way the cooperative societies have worked for years. That we don't talk about profit, but surplus.
You talk to people who are high up in the organisation and say, look, this would work. Let's take Lancashire was spending millions, still are, on with difficult children, shipping them out to care homes in other places. And I was saying, you've got education, you've got health, you've got social care, all under your grip. If you can't get a home together that can provide for these children, and
in
then,
a place like Lancashire,
and then sell places to other authorities that will cover the cost of it. It's a mindset that.
What caught my eye, it was a real privilege last week to spend some time, about 30 minutes or so, talking to Sir Michael Barber, and I was really struck at the end of the conversation. Michael spoke about what he would do for recovery, and you know what, there was clear alignment with what Sir Kevin Collins came up with, you know, and this lack of investment and lack of a real desire. It's as if to say, we've got through it, it's forgotten now, you know, we can move on, get back to the old normal, without really considering what the impact of this has been. And for me, the one good thing of the lockdowns is it highlighted the gap between those that have and those that haven't. And so Michael spoke about, you know, opportunities in the arts, opportunities to, you know, to visit places, and I was really struck by sort of a breadth of thinking about what the curriculum, a really effective education looks like, you know, and actually your immediate returns are not now. So the immediate return may be going to a theatre, maybe going to see Shakespeare at the Globe and actually hating it. But the fact that you'd had that experience, not that you hated it, but the fact you went to the Globe, the fact you went to London to see it, you know, actually all of that is part of that experience that, you know, some children just don't have that opportunity, you know. So it is about trying to open that up and, you know, reflecting on it, thinking, well, Sir Kevin Collins's 15 billion was never going to be enough, was it? You know, actually we should have been much more ambitious than that, you know, but good on him for setting that ball rolling and actually holding up to his principles and saying, no, you know, if you're not going to deliver it, I was asked to give you a plan, then I'm not going to be part of it. So, you know, a principled approach taken. I won't forget it. I didn't agree with all of it, but I've gone back to revisit what he was saying and think, gosh, you know, we've fallen well short with just a few bits of tutoring and a few laptops.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're at the end, near the end. We go to room 101 now, Stan. So you're not in room 01 this week.
I've been let out now.
Let out. So David, what are you going to put in room 101?
Okay. I cannot believe that we are still having a debate about grammar schools. And it comes round almost 3 or 4 times a year, regular as clockwork. And I see with the appointment of the new ministers who are all pro grammar schools in the DFE this week, and this debate's going to come back again. And it is never going to happen because there is no capacity to do the parliamentary law change. There's no money to build them. It'll probably be a little bit of tinkering at the edges of maybe increasing PAN or something like that. But the bit that really frustrates me about it, which is why I was sticking at 101, is that every time you have a debate about grammar schools, you effectively have to have a debate about secondary moderns as well. And all of those people who think grammar schools are great always seem to have the view that their kids would automatically get into one.
Yes.
And the reality of that is that just ain't true. And the experience that we see in the sector of what happens to educational performance in communities where there is selective education is that the kids who don't pass 11 plus get a very different experience and start in life. And that is just, for me, completely and utterly wrong. And I know people will counter that and show me data that shows how well grammar schools are doing and how great their progress aid scores are. But they bloody well ought to be, given the clientele that they're educating.
Yeah.
And I've seen lots of grammar schools say, well, look, we'll counter this. We'll set up a multi-academy trust and we'll bring these schools into it. And they very rarely do. And when they have, they failed. So, you know, I think room 101 for me should forever be enshrined the grammar school room.
Wow.
Well, there's a grammar school in Lancashire that's just gone into special measures from outstanding.
And also, just to add to the part, I mean, the Culp Academies Trust had to take on a large secondary school in North Manchester that was sponsored by a very large and highly successful, elite grammar school in the south of the city, because they couldn't make it work. And I was delighted to see the progress that new school now has made, not under my leadership, but it's done really, really well. So
That's
anyway,
good.
thank you, David.
Pleasure.
Great to have you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Stan. We'll be back next week with another guest, and and I hope everybody has a good week, and keep smiling, I suppose. Anyway, see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.